Lori Lambert Williams is one of the leading teachers in controlled remote viewing in the country. Her gifts have helped others open to their own abilities to use various parts of the brain to enhance cognitive and intuitive functioning for better strategic planning, decision making, and life choices.
Hi, my name is Lori Lambert Williams. I'm the author of Boundless, your how-to guide for practical remote viewing. And I'm a teacher of remote viewing, of various types of remote viewing, including the type of remote viewing that the US military used for 20 years to get and supplement military intelligence.
So, Lori, thank you for being here. I know you didn't start out as a remote viewer, but you were quite psychic as a young child. Can you talk a little bit about your childhood and what that ability was for you, and if there was a point where you just shut it down?
Actually, I know there was never a point at which I shut it down. I thought everybody had the same things going on that I was having going on. I just thought that was the way humans were. And so I never felt the need to. And thankfully, because my mother, who was 100% Sicilian, because she had grown up with a mother who was psychic, and she was psychic, and she saw ghosts and had premonitions and things like that. So she was actually pretty open to it, and she didn't discourage it or anything. She didn't tell me I was nuts or, so I felt that I didn't ever feel like it was something shameful or anything to be afraid of, as I was growing up. It just seemed normal for me to have things happen that, when she would be talking to my grandfather on the phone and I could hear his responses to her in my head. And it didn't occur to me that that was odd, just doesn't everybody do this and that? Isn't this just how senses work? I feel like my whole sense of existence was all about that there's a reason for being here. And my whole goal from as early as I can remember was to make a difference and to fulfill whatever I was here to fulfill. I had a sense that I was here to fulfill something and I needed to do that. So it seems like every stage of life, I think we all go through stages in life and different periods of life where we're doing one thing and then we move on to something else. And so I've had three major stages in life. And at each stage, that was it. It was like, okay, what am I supposed to do now? Like, in what way am I here to serve? And I always felt like I was here to serve in some way. That was always the goal. So,
The first modality, as far as I know, that you really dove deeply into was remote viewing, and your mentor, your teacher, was Lyn Buchanan, who's very well recognized in the field, obviously. Can you describe how you met up with Lynn and what that remote viewing experience was for you in the early days?
Since I'd had a lot of psychic experiences and yet was for 20 years of my life, I was a missionary, traveling around talking about Jesus. And the interesting thing is that the group that I was involved with, it was okay. Psychic stuff was okay as long as you framed it in, well, this is a word from the Lord, or, this is a prophecy or whatever. As long as it was kind of couched in biblical language, you were okay. But if it was couched in anything else, then you were walking a fine line. Maybe you were going to get demon possessed or whatever. So there was a lot of fearfulness built into that. And so when I left that lifestyle and was now kind of like, okay, I'm ready to explore this part of me that I've never really dove into and explored, I was like, well, how do I reconcile that? Like, where do I start exploring this? I knew that I didn't want to go the route of witchcraft or anything like that. I just wanted to understand myself really and understand where these experiences come from, like having visions that are portending something that save your life, or seeing spirits and then getting some kind of feedback that you weren't just hallucinating. That was, there was something really there. All the different types of things that were happening to me. When I wanted to reconcile them, I thought, well, how can I reconcile them with this Christian belief system? Is it of the devil? Is it not of the devil? What is it? And I had just gotten a job as the head of a refugee resettlement program. I was attending a conference in Denver about post-traumatic stress disorder when I had a dream about a man who was presenting at the conference, and they had introduced him as Colonel so and so. And I remember thinking before I fell asleep, how weird, I'd never met a colonel in my life. And then 3 days ago, I met my first colonel, and now here's this other colonel. It's like two colonels in 1 week, what's that about? And so I ended up dreaming that I was talking to this man who was a total stranger, and I hadn't spoken to him. But in the dream, I was talking to him, and I was telling him that I had just met my first colonel. And so that was all there was to the dream, is that I told him about this other colonel that I'd met. But when I ended up going the next morning to attend the conference for the next day, we got there early, both of us, and we're standing there alone, two strangers, waiting for the ballroom doors to get unlocked. And I looked at him and I said, I had a dream about you last night. And he was like, you did? And I always joke that my mom used to say, if you want a man to remember you, tell him you had a dream about him. So anyway, so I told him about the dream, and then he said, well, what branch of the military is this colonel that you just met? What branch of the military is he in? And I said, I'm not sure, because I mean, I'm a zero when it comes to the military and understanding ranks and all this stuff, but I just said, well, I'm not sure, but I think he was in military intelligence. And he said, oh, interesting. I was in military intelligence. And right as he said that, the cover of a book that I had seen on the new arrivals shelf at the bookstore popped into my mind. And I just, without thinking, I said, oh my gosh, have you seen that new book? And he said, what new book? And I said, I don't remember the name of it, but it's turquoise and black on the cover, and it has something to do with psychics in the military. And he said, are you talking about Psychic Warrior by David Morehouse? And I was like, that is the book. Because I didn't buy the book. I just had looked at it. And he was suddenly very interested. And he starts kind of leaning into my space, and he's kind of looking at me differently. And he's saying, well, it's really interesting you mentioned that book, because I'm a major character in that book, because I was the psychologist in charge of that program for 20 years. And, he was in charge of vetting the guys that would go into the program, and I guess to make sure that they were psychologically sound. But anyway, so then he starts saying, oh my goodness, do you have kind of a photographic memory for numbers? Do you remember maps easily? Are you artistic? He just started asking me these questions, and those are the three questions I remember, but he was shooting those questions at me pretty fast. He's like, we would have loved to have you in our program. And by this time, people are filing in, and we're going into the ball, and I'm just sort of creeped out by the guy, to be honest. I was like, I think it's time for me to move away. So, because back then I was pretty fearful about things, so I was like trying to get away from him. And I think he could sense I was like, okay, time to end this conversation. So he's like, wait, before you go, when you get back home, go on the internet, which was pretty new at the time. This was 1996. He's like, go on the internet and look up. First, he told me to look up Targum Puthoff. And I was like, what? I had no idea what he was talking about. And that's because he was referring to Harold Puthoff, who was, and Russell Targ, two physicists who were hired by the US military at the top secret think tank, Stanford Research Institute in Palo Alto, to research telepathy, ESP, and all that kind of thing. So he's like, look up Targum Puthoff. And I was like, what? And he said, just look up controlled remote viewing. Look up controlled remote viewing. Because I think he realized I would remember that more easily. So I got home a few days later, but I didn't forget that. And the minute I got home, I sat down and I looked up controlled remote viewing. And up came this website that said, what is CRV? And then it explained controlled remote viewing, but the way it explained it was so beautifully written. And it was sort of like I heard that, the bells going off and everything. It was like, Eureka, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. It just painted our abilities as humans to access another sense besides seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching, the ability to sense things, outside of time and space is just inherent in the human being. And it's no more different or more evil than your ability to see or hear or smell or taste or touch, right? So then I was just like, oh my gosh, this is really cool, and I just thought it was really normal, and I was excited. So I wrote him an email to the email on his website, and it was Lyn Buchanan, and he responded with a beautiful response, just very kind. And then I found myself stuck. I was, I lived in Amarillo, Texas at the time, but I found myself stuck in Maryland like a week or two later. I had to go there for a conference, but it was back in the days, probably none of your listeners even know about this, but there was a period of time when if you were going to fly, your tickets would cost X amount, but if you stayed over a weekend, it reduced the price of the tickets. It was like it greatly reduced the price of tickets if you came, if you spent a weekend. So whoever's bought my tickets from our company made it so that I had to stay till Monday. But the conference ended on Friday. So I had the weekend I was totally alone, didn't know anybody, and I'm there in Baltimore, Maryland. So I called him because he had given me his phone number, and I called him, and he sounded so sweet and grandfatherly on the phone. He had a very soft and sweet voice, and said, "Oh, my wife and I, we're going to church on Sunday. Would you like to visit us on Sunday after church?" And I was thinking, okay, he doesn't sound like a murderer. So I remember thinking if I can rent a car for 24.99, I'll know I'm supposed to go. And I picked up the Hertz phone in the lobby, and they said, "Well, we have a car for tomorrow for 24.99." And I was like, "Okay, that's my sign." So anyway, that was the beginning. I drove to where Lyn lived because at that time he lived in Mechanicsville, Maryland. And so I drove to Mechanicsville. He sent a little map to the hotel so I could figure out how to get there. And we spent hours talking, and it was just, I felt such a kindred spirit, it was just like I'd come home. It was really wonderful.
And
And the
he
hilarious,
did teach you remote viewing, and you became quite remarkable within the field. Can you describe what it was to tell other people that you were a remote viewer? What
yes,
was that experience? Yeah.
I was just beyond excited with the whole concept of CRV. I mean, here I was a mom of 7 kids, and I had a grandbaby at the time. Now I have 22 grandkids and a great grandbaby, but
Oh
but
my
back
gosh.
I know. But back then, I mean, even though I had this wonderful job and it was a new job too. Everything was happening at the same time. And I was so excited by the job, and I was so excited by the idea that you could gain control over your senses, over your ability to sense things through time and space, and actually kind of aim that and get information on demand as you needed it. To me, that just seemed so unbelievable, just so crazy and so amazing. And I was so excited. Couldn't get enough. I just couldn't get enough. I wanted to be 100% full-time learning about remote viewing.
How did you come out to others? How did you out yourself that
Okay,
you're
so at the
remote
time,
viewing?
because I had just started in this refugee program, and I was writing grants, and we were also very dependent upon donations. It was a nonprofit that I was working for. And so I was actually in the closet like big time as far as this goes, because I didn't know if it would hurt if it would hurt our donations, or, because it was a Catholic organization, very religious organization that I was working for. So I was in the closet for a number of years. And when I started teaching this in 2000, I was still working at that job, and I was very much in charge of fundraising. So I was still very much in the closet. So people were flying into Amarillo to sit at my dining table and learn remote viewing. But people in Amarillo didn't know I was doing this. So it was kind of funny because my husband at the time, who was working as a forensic scientist, that was his career. He was also a Reiki master, and he would have a Reiki night once a week where people could come and get Reiki. And he had a Reiki group where he was the leader of. So one night when one of the students was there and asked if they could come to Reiki, so I bring a student with me to Reiki, and they're like, "Oh, what are you doing here from North Carolina?" And he said, "Well, I'm here taking Lori's class." And they're like, "Lori teaches a class?" And so it was like everybody was angry at me because they were like, "You've been teaching this for how many years and we didn't know? And you've been working with us and you never told us?" I didn't tell anybody in Amarillo. And then around 2009, I think it was, or 2010. Now, all this time, I had just opened my door and taught whoever Lyn and his wife sent me to teach. that was all I had to do. And then they paid me, so and so there was a point at which Lynn's wife's health was kind of going downhill. And she said, Lori, I'm not going to be able to do this much longer. You're going to have to go out on your own. You have to go out on your own. So I knew I was going to have to teach this. And so, when I decided to leave the business, I was stop the mission, I mean, the social work that I was doing for this nonprofit. It was 2006, and my present husband, Jim, I was married to him by that time, and he was said, yeah, do it. I think you should just go all in and just quit your job. And, I can support us until things get rolling. So I had quit my job in 2006, but simultaneously, the day that I quit my job, this massive article came out on the front page of the Amarillo newspaper, on the Sunday version, which was the big one that everybody read. And it took up all of the front page plus half a page 4A. And it was all about me and CRV and my teaching. So I came out in a huge way in Amarillo via the newspaper. And I got thousands and thousands of emails as a result of that. People in Amarillo were clamoring to take it. They were really, really excited. So I hit the road on my own in 2010, I think starting January 1st. And it was kind of funny because I was standing in a friend's bookstore talking to Jim, and I guess people could hear us, but we weren't thinking about anybody being able to hear us. And I said, well, I'm on my own. I got to set up a class. I said, I think I'm just going to set up a class in Amarillo and give everybody like an Amarillo discount. And I looked up, and suddenly people were walking over, and people lined up and said, we want to sign up for your class. So I had 11 students just like that. It was crazy. So
That's
just
an unbelievable story. And the universe obviously had your back, Lynn. But what are some of the benefits of remote viewing? What did you experience as a remote viewer that was a practical application to your life? And what are your students experiencing now? Because you're still teaching remote viewing,
yeah,
which is amazing that we have this incredible resource, available. So
it's been a long time, and I'm getting there. But in a personal way, what CRV has done for me has given me, it's really taken away fear, because as I mentioned, I had a lot of anxiety and I was very fearful. And it's interesting because a lot of the things that I was really fearful about are actually happening now in the world. The kind of what we're experiencing right now. This today is August 8th of 2025, in case this stays on the internet for years and years. Um, and what we're experiencing right now in the country, in the United States, and even around the world, is kind of things that I was pretty anxious about for many years. And here we are now experiencing them, and I'm a lot less anxious now than I was many years ago, even though now it's actually happening. So it's kind of interesting. I feel like that's for me been a huge benefit, is it's given me more faith in just kind of how we're here for a purpose. And that purpose might be as simple as we're just here to experience life through these bodies, because we're all part of the universe. It's kind of like we're a drop from the ocean, and then when we die, we just go back and become part of the ocean again. So my belief system has also been altered drastically through remote viewing because of my own remote viewing experiences. The universe kind of slowly pushed me into a different belief system by having me get assigned paid targets that were asking me to view things that I didn't even believe in prior to being asked to view them.
can
You
you
know,
give us one
yeah,
example, a
well, yeah.
concrete example?
For example, I was tasked with the Kinross incident. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Kinross incident.
I'm not familiar with that.
Well, so when I was tasked with this, again, it was probably in the early 2000s, and I was actually tasked with it. It was a paid project, and the person who tasked me was the head of MUFON in a certain state here in the U.S. And the Kinross incident happened, I believe it was 1957, but it was definitely in the 1950s. And it was this jet. They scrambled a jet because the Air Force in Madison, Wisconsin, had picked up a blip on the radar that they didn't recognize. And they were like, we need to send a jet out there and find out what that is. So they watched the jet as it on the radar. They watched it as it's coming close to this blip that's blipping away. And then the jet gets close to the blip and suddenly they merge and vanish on the radar. So they scrambled another jet to see what happened. And I think the second jet also disappeared. And so, anyway, long story short, they never found debris. They never found anything, and it was over the Great Lakes. So I was tasked along with another viewer who had been in the military. He was the first guy they put into the newly assigned applications branch of the psychic spying unit. So they had the research branch in Palo Alto, and then they had the applications. These were the guys who were on the ground doing actual remote viewing to provide intel. And so Melvin C. Riley was the first guy they put in that unit, and he was the only one of all the soldiers who went through that unit. He was the only one who served 2 tours of duty. So he was there 8 years, but he was there 4 years, and then he was off somewhere else for 4 years, and then they brought him back for another 4 years. And he became really one of my best friends in the whole world. He's passed away now, but gosh, I loved the relationship we had. We had such a good friendship, and I could call him and talk to him about anything. So and Lyn at the time, in my impression of Lyn, our perception of things are not always the way they are, but my impression of Lyn was that he was very anti-woo-woo. I've since discovered that he's really not nearly as anti-woo-woo as I thought, or maybe in his old age he's become less woo-woo. But I think that in general, and this is just my opinion, but in general, my impression from a lot of the military guys, because I know Joe McMoneagle and Lyn Buchanan and Mel Riley and Paul Smith and all these different guys, Skip Atwater and different people. I think that their concern was if it got associated with, the gypsy and the fortune telling tent, or, with the palm, the neon palm in the window kind of a thing, that it would really lessen its credibility, and that they then and their careers in the military would also be kind of ripped to shreds. So as a result, they kind of all had a kind of a look down their nose attitude towards mediums and psychics and people like that, because CRV was far superior to all this, and that kind of a thing. And it was also quite misogynistic, to be honest. I mean, it was all male, right? So it was. I felt that it was kind of misogynistic from a female perspective at the time, but then the thing about Mel was he wasn't, because he had been raised in the Ho-Chunk tradition, of the Ho-Chunk tribe in Wisconsin, and so he was very metaphysical. Just he was so metaphysical that, and he didn't have any religious overtones to anything because he had been raised with the Native Americans. And so I just felt like I could call him and tell him the weirdest things and think they sounded totally nuts, and he would totally get it. And then he would tell me something that was equally weird and equally nuts sounding. And so we really, and then we ended up having the same exact remote viewing experience when we were both assigned to the same target. Years later, it wasn't the Kinross one, it was a different one, but we were both assigned to this target. And then we both had the same very strange experience. And so when I sent in my report, because again, this was another paid project, then they said, oh, you've got to call Mel Riley right away. He wants you to talk. I want you to call him. And when I called him, he was like, tell me everything that happened and don't hold anything back. And that was really what started our really deep friendship. We knew each other before that, but that became like a real bonding thing that happened to us. And actually, your listeners can read all about all of this on my website at intuitivespecialists.com. There's an S at the end of specialists. Intuitivespecialist.com, there's a section with blogs. And there's a blog called 18 Years of Excitement. And I wrote it after I'd been a remote viewer for 18 years. Now we're going on 30 years. But back then, but this 18 years of excitement I wrote all about this experience that Mel and I both had. And it was viewing Mars. We both had a wild experience when we were targeted, blind task, didn't know what we were viewing. But we both had the same exact experience with these beings that showed up and gave us a very interesting message about, the concern for the planet, for Earth, and just talking about how what love really is, and how love is a force. It's way more than humans understand what love is. That love is actually a very strong force, and that it's extremely powerful, and it's so much more than we realize. And so they talked about that. They also talked about vibrational frequencies and how everything runs on that, etc. And it was stuff that was way outside of my lexicon at the time. So when I would have these experiences, and I remember viewing the Kinross thing, I viewed that over a period of months. When I was viewing that, there was a point at which I suddenly found myself in a spaceship. So, and this was early on, this Kinross assignment was, like I said, it was maybe 1998, 99 or something. And I'm suddenly on a spaceship, and it's being controlled through consciousness. And there is a being that kind of was the leader of some sort, like a captain or something. And there, instead of there being buttons and dials and switches and things like this, there was this curved dashboard thing. And it just had kind of just sort of screens that were blank. And then this guy would just come over and he would pass his hand over it. And that's how he controlled everything on the ship, is through consciousness and just passing his hand over this blank dashboard thing. And which I had never seen anything like that. So what I was perceiving was so outside of anything in my educational history and anything in my knowledge, that it would just, having these things happen were so mind-blowing. And I remember calling Lyn because I came face to face with what I thought was an alien. It could have been an alien. It could have been back in the 50s, the pilots would wear those big rubber, oxygen things. So it could have been that as well. But at the time, all I knew was that I was looking at a being that was alive, that the facial construction didn't make sense. So I called Lyn and I said, Lyn, I'm starting to view things that are pushing the boundaries of my belief system. and and Lyn just laughed, and he said, yes, yes, remote viewing will do that. But then I said, I he said, but Lori, think about it, because Lyn was raised Baptist, and then he became a Methodist minister too. Part of his career was being a Methodist minister, which made him the perfect teacher for me, coming from this missionary experience, right? But then he said, Lori, think about it. There's really no conflict, because if God is the God of this planet, why wouldn't God be the God of all the universes and all the all the parallel universes and everything else? Why can't there be more? And I was like, well, that's true. I hadn't really thought of it that way. So it was really it's just been a journey that's brought me, from this very rigid kind of a binary belief system, black and white, good and evil, God and the devil, kind of a binary system, to a much more amplified understanding of how everything works. So that was a huge benefit for me, and that freed me from a lot of fear. Now, it's interesting because I took a poll of my students at one time. This was many years ago, but I asked them what did they feel the greatest benefit they had gotten from becoming remote viewers. And the most common answer really surprised me. It was confidence.
Wow.
They felt that they had really gained a ton of confidence, which is amazing. They also, another thing that a lot of people have said is that it really helped them get to know themselves. Because you find out that there's a lot of aspects to your own personality, your belief systems, your prejudices, your stereotypes that you don't even know exist. But CRV will just butt you right up against those things.
I know people are going to be interested. Where do they find more information about you and about what you offer?
Oh, that's great. Well, I have a free course. And when I created the free course, it's a 4-part course. It's close to 4 hours. Plus, it has an additional 4 hours of Q&A that they can watch. So it's almost 8 hours of free information.
Wow.
And it's interesting because when I was thinking about what could I do when I was ready to really reach more people, I wanted to reach more people. I thought I need to create a free class where the person can take it without spending any money, and actually do a remote viewing session for themselves and
Wow.
see how it
And
works.
I just want to thank you so much for sharing your experience and your strength and all you've learned and the hope that you've given
Thank
today.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate it.